Patriotism is not nation worship, such as we saw in Europe in the 1930s. It is not that spirit of nationalism that must denigrate or dominate other nations. It is a passionate attachment to one's own country, its land, its people, its past, its heroes, literature, language, traditions, culture and customs. It is what enables a people to endure crushing oppression, as the Poles did for 50 years of Bolshevik and Nazi rule. Intellectuals tend to forget, wrote Regis Debray, that nations hibernate, but empires grow old. The American nation will outlast the Atlantic Empire as the Russian nation will outlast the Soviet Empire. This is the traditionalist view of a nation. It is how General de Gaulle saw France. According to the Gaullist vision, writes the conservative scholar Roger Scruton, a nation is defined not by institutions or borders especially, but by language, religion, and high culture. In times of turmoil and conquest, it is those spiritual things that must be protected and affirmed. In his 1967 visit to Canada, de Gaulle ignited a storm by declaring from the balcony of Montreal's City Hall, "Vive le Québec libre," the defiant cry of the Québécois, who yet dream of secession and nationhood. Quebec remains a province of Canada, but the nation Quebec lives in the hearts of millions of French Canadians. A century ago, the French historian and philosopher Ernest Renan described a nation as thus: "A nation is a living soul, a spiritual principle. Two things, which in truth are but one, constitute this soul. One is in the past, the other in the present. One is the common possession of a rich heritage of memories. The other is the actual consent, the desire to live together, the will to preserve worthily the undivided inheritance which has been handed down. The nation, like the individual, is the outcome of a long past of efforts and sacrifices and devotions. To have common glories in the past, a common will in the present, to have done great things together, to will to do the like again, such are the essential conditions for the making of a people. This community called a nation is much more than a division of labour or a market that may encompass the nation. Community of interests is assuredly a powerful bond between men, but can interests suffice to make a nation? I do not believe it. Community of interests makes commercial treaties. There is a sentimental side to nationality. It is at once body and soul. A Zollverein is not a fatherland. An economic union, like the European Union, is not a nation. An economy is not a country. An economic system should strengthen the bonds of national union, but the nation is of a higher order than the construct of any economist. A nation is organic. A nation is alive. A nation has a beating heart. A constitution does not create a nation. A nation writes a constitution that is the birth certificate of the nation already born in the hearts of its people. So it was with the American nation. For a nation to endure, its people must form a moral and a social community, and share higher values than economic interests. At the time of the Civil War, that moral community, that social union, had ceased to exist. In the South, there was no longer the will to stay together, but a fierce will to separate, to divorce, to live apart. Slavery and the tariff were but the battleground quarrels, behind which was a burning southern desire to be free of all the North had come to represent. The 133rd Psalm speaks of an embryonic nation. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. The word occurs even earlier in the Old Testament. Genesis 10:32, after listing the descendants of Noah, relates, "These are the families of the sons of Noah, after their generations, in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood." Nation, as suggested by its Latin root, nascere, to be born, intrinsically implies a link by blood, wrote Peter Brimelow in the National Review in 1992. A nation in a real sense is an extended family. The merging process through which all nations pass is not merely cultural, but to a considerable extent biological through intermarriage. Brimelow describes a nation as an ethno-cultural community, an interlacing of ethnicity and culture that speaks one language. He cites the late senator from New York. In his recent book Pandemonium, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan even used this rigorous definition in an effort to capture both culture and ethnicity. A nation is a group of people who believe they are ancestrally related. It is the largest group that shares that belief. To be a nation, a people must believe they are a nation, and that they share a common ancestry, history and destiny. Whatever ethnic group to which we may belong, we Americans must see ourselves as of a unique and common nationality in order to remain a nation. In From Under the Rubble, Solzhenitsyn quotes the Russian Christian dissident Vadim Bozorov on nations as creations of God himself. Quote, "In Christ's time, there were many peoples already existing on earth, occupying various territories, speaking various languages and warring with one another. Was their appearance merely a historical accident? The words of the Bible about the nations thou hast made answers this question in the negative. The existence of peoples was part of the plan of creation, forming part of God's design for the world." Solzhenitsyn believed in the providential origin of nations and, in his Nobel Prize and address, spoke of their indispensability to mankind's existence and essential worth. The disappearance of nations would impoverish us no less than if all men had become alike with one personality, one face. Nations are the wealth of mankind.